Welcome. This is a technical presentation of the current state of the Chinese petroleum sector and its impact on the world's energy balance. I am Jordan Burris, and I will be presenting today's information. This project was created by Aaron Malik, Cody Harris, Michael Kershaw, and myself for Petty 1010 at Louisiana State University. So why study China? What is China's significance on the world's energy market? Here are a couple interesting facts. According to the EIA, China has accounted for 43% of the world's oil demand growth in 2014. Another interesting fact is that China is the world's largest net importer of petroleum and other liquids. This is mostly due to China's population of 1.35 billion people and its growth of its middle class. It is estimated that 326 million new middle-class citizens will emerge in China from 2014 to 2030. This would raise the total middle-class population to 854 million people. Let's go over a game plan for today's presentation. First, we will explore the history of oil and gas in China. Then we will dive into domestic exploration, production, and refining. Then we will look into China's oil imports, pipeline connections, and overseas acquisitions. And finally, we will discuss the Chinese growth dilemma and conclude the presentation. Let's start with the history of oil and gas in China. The Chinese have been using oil and natural gas for over 2,000 years. They first used bamboo stalks to capture natural gas from the ground to burn in stoves. As early as 100 BC, the Chinese were drilling as deep as 800 feet to capture natural gas and salt water. Fast forward a couple thousands of years to the 1950s, and the Chinese population has grown significantly, and most of the oil in China was imported. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, many large petroleum reserves were discovered, which turned China into a net exporter of oil. By 1973, they were able to export 1 million tons of crude oil to Japan. Exports rose in the 1970s from 6.6 million tons to 13.5 million tons. During the 1970s, China began to explore offshore drilling. Foreign oil companies were brought in to explore areas around the South China Sea and the Gulf of Tonkin. At the time, little oil was found, so China decided to invest more in onshore drilling. About this same time, natural gas became a major source of energy in China. In 1985, they produced 12 billion cubic meters of natural gas, totaling 3% of its total energy supply. Reserves of natural gas in China is estimated to be between 130 billion and 24 trillion cubic meters. To wrap up the history section of Chinese oil and gas, in the 1960s, China, with the help of Japan and Europe, began to modernize its refineries. In the 1970s, emphasis was put on building pipelines to transport this newly refined oil. By 1986, Chinese refineries were processing approximately 2.1 million barrels per day. And in 1988, the China National Petroleum Corporation was created and remains the largest energy company in China to this day. So now let's switch gears to the domestic exploration, production, and refining. Recently, China and its national oil companies have invested large amounts of money on enhanced oil recovery techniques such as water injection, polymer flooding, and steam flooding. This is to offset production declines in mature oil fields. Historically, Chinese oil exploration was dominated by the Chinese national oil companies, but more recently, China has granted access to international oil companies in order to gain technical knowledge from them. The Chinese national oil companies are willing to allow the international oil companies to explore as long as they work in conjunction with the national oil companies in order to transfer this technical knowledge and information. Chinese production. The largest oil fields in China are mature and production has peaked. Therefore, emphasis has been put on enhanced oil recovery techniques to continue production. They are also developing new oil fields in western interior provinces. It is estimated by the EIA that as many as 32 billion barrels of oil is recoverable from shale oil reserves in China. This shows how much potential China has in domestic production. Moving on to refining, it is estimated that current refining capacity will exceed 14 million barrels per day this year. Multiple new refineries are also being built to increase this capacity. With the current low oil price environment, some of these construction projects are being delayed. Changing gears once again to Chinese imports. It is expected that oil imports will continue to rise due to the increased oil demand and building of its strategic petroleum reserves. China is second only to the United States in oil imports and actually surpassed the United States in April and June of this year. China accounts for 43% of the world's oil consumption growth, as in 2014. In the past 10 years, China has had to change its import strategy to meet demand and to minimize risk from geopolitical uncertainties. In 2014, China's primary import locations were the Middle East, which supplied 52%, Africa, which supplied 22%, Russia and the former Soviet Union, which supplied 13%, and the Americas, which supplied 11%. Here is a figure by the EIA that shows individual countries' contribution to the oil imports. Most notably are Saudi Arabia at 16%, Angola at 13%, and Russia at 11%. In the past, China imported significant amounts of oil from Iran, Sudan and South Sudan, and Libya. These countries all experienced significant supply chain interruptions due to political conflicts in recent years. For example, Iran's supply was interrupted due to the nuclear disagreement in 2012 when the United States and Europe put export sanctions on Iran. China had to reduce its imports from Iran by 110,000 barrels per day in order to maintain diplomatic ties with the United States and Europe. In April of this year, a new agreement has been signed to slowly lift these sanctions, as long as Iran follows the guidelines of the nuclear agreement. In 2011, civil war in Sudan and South Sudan significantly reduced exports. China was importing 260,000 barrels per day in 2011 from Sudan, and by 2012, that figure had dropped to zero. This resulted in a 5% drop in total oil imports overnight. Libya, in the same year, experienced civil war and the ousting of the Gaddafi regime. China had invested large amounts of money in people and infrastructure in this region, and now to experience another significant supply chain interruption. More recently, China has invested in Angola, Venezuela, Russia, and Iraq for its imported oil. These countries are thought to have greater stability politically, therefore lower risk of supply chain interruption. China has invested in these countries by oil for loan deals. These are loans financed by the Chinese government to develop infrastructure for oil and gas development in return for imports at established prices. $150 billion of these investments were made in 2013. China has also used these loans to invest in transnational pipelines to import this oil. The first was in Kazakhstan in 2006. It links Kazakhstan and Russian oil to China. The Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean Pipeline also links Russian oil to China. This pipeline and its seaport is expected to export up to 1.6 million barrels per day to China by 2020. The most recently built pipeline is the Myanmar pipeline. This pipeline will divert seagoing transport of Middle Eastern oil from the Strait of Malacca, which is known for its piracy. Its capacity will be 440,000 barrels per day. In order to further diversify its sources of oil, Chinese national oil companies have invested in overseas acquisitions of oil fields. They now operate in 42 different countries around the world, investing $73 billion between 2011 and 2013. These investments produce 1.3 million barrels per day in 2010 and was up to 2.1 million barrels per day in 2013. One of the primary reasons national oil companies have invested with international oil companies is the gain of technical knowledge in tight oil and gas plays. This knowledge is needed for the future development of mainland China. China's biggest single investment was the purchase of the Canadian oil company Nexen for $15.1 billion in 2013. Nexen has experience in tight oil gas plays in Canada. This acquisition, in addition to the partnerships with other international oil companies, is all an effort to gain knowledge to develop the future domestic production in China. Now onto China's growth dilemma. China's economy has been the driving force behind world energy consumption over the past couple decades. Consumption growth was as high as 11% in 2010. As you can see in this figure by the EIA, China surpassed every other country in 2014 in net oil imports. For perspective, it imported 1 million barrels more of oil per day, more than the United States in 2014. These imports are needed to match growth of the Chinese middle class. In 2000, only 4% of urban households were in the middle class. By 2012, that figure, with the growth of the middle class, energy consumption will continue to soar, and the use of electricity and fuel in cars will increase this demand. It is estimated by the EIA that by 2040, China will use 20 million barrels of oil per day, and that it will exceed U.S. consumption by 2034. As demand rises, the gap between domestic production and consumption will continue to spread. As mentioned earlier, China has chosen to diversify import sources to meet this demand. China has also spread its influence in the East and China Seas in order to develop offshore production in the area. In addition to demand growth from the middle class, China has chosen to build its strategic petroleum reserves. The communist government wants to build storage of 500 million barrels of oil. They want to have at least 90 days supply by 2020. Currently, there is approximately 180 million barrels of storage built. So in conclusion, China is a major player on the world stage of oil and gas production and consumption. Initial use of natural gas dates back to over 2,000 years ago. Chinese domestic oil exploration and production is dominated by its national oil companies, which have recently formed partnerships with international oil companies to gain technical knowledge of tight oil and gas plays. China has become one of the world's leading importers of crude oil in order to meet its demand needs. Recently, China has diversified its import network to minimize possible supply chain interruptions. China has also built a large network of transnational pipelines and have acquired overseas oil and gas fields to supplement domestic production. Building of its strategic petroleum reserves and growth of China's middle class will continue to fuel energy demand. This concludes this presentation. I would like to thank you for your time and your interest.